Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
We're going to start. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Hall and John Columnist from University of either Bath or Bath, depending which part of England you're from, or America. And they're going to be talking about convergence research in the UK, which is video and vision and graphics. And John will be talking in more detail about a lot of the research that he's done. So I'll let them take it away.
Well, thanks for that, David, and thanks for coming along. So I'm privileged to be chair of the Vision, Video and Graphics Network in the UK. And as part of that, I've come across to find out what's going on in the States. And in Canada, we've been through Toronto, and we're going down to Berkeley over the weekend. So the VVG network is funded by EPSRC, which is a government funding body over in the UK. And its aim really is to foster the convergence between the vision and the graphics areas. And it's something that you guys, I know, are very active in. We've got some funds, essentially, for cross-discipline research. So the idea is to take a researcher from one lab and pay for them to go and do some work in a different sort of lab. We organise conferences. VVG03 was something that I set up, and VVG05 is taking place in Edinburgh, and we're hoping to move into continental Europe in years to come. We also run seminars, typically one-day seminars down in London or Oxford or various other places in the country. And one of the keys, I think, to the VVG network is that it's community-owned. So rather than have a small group of people decide what the area is about, it's really defined by the interests of the community, and rather than by any particular individual. And of course, we want to fund novel research, but typically PhDs want to live someplace, so we fund that. They want to travel, and if they've got out-of-pocket expenses, we can do that and fund that too. And because it's run by academics for academics, we've made it very light administration on top. This contrasts with typical government funding, which is especially EU funding in actual fact, which is run by the French and has that. The example projects are, we've got a few going on at the moment. The Surrey and Sheffield. Sheffield is Alan Watt and Steve Maddock. They're interested in graphics principally, and Surrey is pattern recognition and computer vision. And they're getting together to do, as you can see, fine-grained motion capture over faces. Cardiff and Tsinghua, so we can go international. They're interested in video hole filling. The holes are dynamic in shape, and the objects that they're filling the holes with are also dynamic. Bath and York, I'm doing some work with Ed Hancock, who's interested in shape from shading. And we'll be looking at integrating shape from motion and shape from shading. And also I'm working with Ayelet Tal over in Israel and doing some work with Gaussian algebra over in the same place, where we were interested in relevance in content-based retrieval. So the kinds of people that are involved, there's Cambridge and Cardiff, and you can see there's quite a whole list there. That's not exhaustive by any means, but that's a fairly representative list. These are the sorts of things that people are doing in Cardiff. Click this and it comes up. Double click. So this is a So that was just a straightforward image that's been driven from the speech, obviously. So that was correlating phonemes and visemes. The contribution there, I think, was, in fact, the McGurk test. The McGurk effect says that if you say a word, the perception of that word is influenced by how you read the lips. So that's the test for goodness they've been using there. For some reason it won't click on. Okay. This is the Cardiff and Tsinghua collaboration. Principally Ralph Martin as the lead here. And I guess you can see what that does. So the VVG network is funding advancement of this work. This is the example really that motivated us to want to fund that work. Neil Dodgson, who's over in Cambridge, probably better known for computer-aided design in geometry, does some work in non-photorealistic rendering and textures. The texture warping analogies appeared in SIGGRAPH a few years back, and more recently he's been able to do things like take pictures and swap their colour palettes over, as you can see on the bottom left, and also use some NPR over compressed images, and there's a range of examples that Neil supplied us with there. This is from Sheffield. I'll just run that anyway. So what's happening here is that there is some stress-based tension. You can't see that, can you? No. Okay.
Make your laptop go external. Close it.
No, it's still not coming up. Okay, we'll not bother with that. You can see that afterwards if you're interested. They're working with Surrey. Let's hope this one works. That doesn't work either.
Usually if you can't see it there, but you can see it there, so you
Aha, okay. So this was taken in a virtual studio, and the contribution here is, I can do this one-handed. Okay. The contribution is that the moving hair and the dress are reconstructed with great accuracy from a few virtual cameras.
You know how many cameras?
I don't, sorry?
Sorry.
2 questions.
Do you know how many cameras were involved in capturing?
I think there's probably of the order of 5 or 7. It's around that sort of number, I think. This is Adrian Hilton's work over in Surrey. Swansea are more known for volume visualization and volume graphics. They would tend to be associated with Eric Kaufman's over in New York. And they're visualizing here movie sequences. And the claim is that by analyzing or visually matching these patterns that are a consequence of processing, that helps, say, the guards at the door, the porters, decide whether there's suspicious activity of one kind or another happening in the corridors. That's from Swansea. This is from York. This is Edwin Hancock's work. What he does is from a single source, a single grey level photograph, get the shape from shading information accurately enough to reconstruct a face. And he's able to do that by referencing a learned statistical model, similar to the point distribution models or active appearance models that came out of Manchester. And if I can show you this. So there's the light changing. And you can see that's really fairly accurate. Edwin claims that without this learned statistical model, the convexities in particular really show up really badly. Edwin's also known, I don't know if for matching graphs. Oxford Brookes, Phil Torr is over in Oxford Brookes. He's just been recently made professor there and sent us this in. So he's a strong researcher in the vision area, and has strong associations, of course, with the University of Oxford and the robotics department there. And here he's been able to segment walking people and also track hands. And there's quite a few ongoing projects over in Oxford Brookes. University College London. This is a real photograph of a real box file with a real shadow. And the investigators here have put an avatar in place. And what's interesting is that if you do it naively, you'll get where the shadows intersect, it becomes too dark. If you do it in a more sophisticated way, the shadows turn out to be correctly aligned in that way, in terms of colour. Harriet Watt, where the next VVG is going to be held, with Emmanuel Trucco, is leading that. They're interested in immersive visual environments, and the point here, of course, is that the table has a rather large screen, and the cameras and other recording devices are set up symmetrically at both ends, so that this person gets the look and feel. The picture that's seen has been reconstructed and projected from the point of view of the participants.
Three separate units. The idea here is each is there 3 locations being depicted here?
There were 2 locations actually. These people here are in a different room.
Okay. 2 different. So there's 3 altogether. Each person is in their own space.
I don't know if there's 3 people or not. That's a good question actually. I imagine that these people were just in the other room, and it's been set up with some nominal. For them, it would be set up, I presume, with some nominal third person. The networks in the UK are actually quite a popular idea. The VVG network is not alone. It's perhaps a very general in nature, whereas there are more specific networks available. For example, over at Imperial College, which is in London, they're interested in they're in a specific network for multimedia retrieval. And you can see the kinds of things that they're interested in and the kinds of people that are involved. And we talk to that community. So what I want to get across, I guess, from the VVG point of view, is that there is a widespread of research in the UK. There are several special purpose and a network of excellence apart from the more general VVG. It's community owned and cross-discipline, and we have some decent international contacts. And with that, I conclude and hand over to John. You can just click on it.
Don't have a mouse button. Is your microphone on?
It's off. Do you want to have it on?
Can you hear me? Is it on? Is it on? Do I have to flick a switch?
It
sounds like it's on. It sounds like an echo. So. Okay, so yeah, good morning. So next 30 or 40 minutes, I'd like to take a little bit of your time to show you some of the convergence research we've been undertaking at the University of Bath. The university itself is, I suppose, comparatively small with relation to the other UK universities, but growing quite rapidly. We're located about 20 miles from the coast, off the west coast of England, the World Heritage City. The computing group at Bath has existed almost as long as the university, but only recently we've become the Department of Computer Science. We were previously part of the Mathematical Sciences Department, and as a consequence, a lot of our past research is in things like computer algebra and so on. But we've got a rapidly growing group looking at multimedia issues, which is the Media Technology Research Centre, and a lot of the graphics and vision work we do there is in this convergence area. Peter Hall, myself, Professor Phil Willis, and we have some PhD students as well up there in brackets. I'm going to present a collection of work we've been undertaking over the last 3 or 4 years. There's some mature work, particularly relating to non-photorealistic rendering, so turning sort of photos and videos into artwork, synthetic artwork, and bringing to bear on that issues such as perceptual salience and machine learning. I'm also going to show you some of our work in progress, which relates to canonical views, perceptual grouping, and also some further machine learning techniques, incremental learning techniques. So, a quick tour. Some of the things we've been able to do in our non-photorealistic rendering are take collections of photographs, turn them into Cubist-like renderings, and also various other painterly rendering techniques here using genetic algorithms. These techniques are unified by an approach that centers around identifying perceptually important or salient features in images and trying to basically use that information to bias the rendering, so importance-driven rendering, if you like. We've also done some work in turning videos into cartoon-like renderings, both introducing motion cues like streak lines and deformations. You can see the example of the basketball there. Also rotoscoping and some video segmentation work for stylisation of the video. I'll give you a tour of that in a moment. First of all, just talk about some of our ongoing work. As I say, a lot of our non-photorealistic rendering work is premised upon the idea of visual salience, and as an extension of that, we're using the salience operators we've developed to train the system into grouping perceptually equivalent regions. These are some early results here color-coded in to show the equivalence classes, and we're using Gestalt cues and a trainable measure to essentially learn equivalence relations between particular classes of texture. We're also interested in canonical or salient views. So views, there are various definitions of this, but a simple one might be views from which objects are most easily recognized. We're currently developing a technique which doesn't rely on feature extraction or some of the more complex approaches that have been taken in the past, such as graph cuts. We're able to produce views equivalent to other people's definitions of canonical views, and also some novel views of our own, for example, top, side, bottom sort of views. We're also interested, as I said, in incremental learning. Our salience measure that I'll show you in a moment for our non-photorealistic rendering is incrementally trained on users can highlight aspects of images, and the system can learn what's important. In order to incrementally train this, we're interested in producing algebras over statistical models. There's been some previous work in our group by Peter a couple of years ago in PAMI in terms of adding eigenmodels together. And we have here some new work in adding Gaussian mixture models, essentially without resampling the data, so just with the components and their statistical properties, determining which components can be dropped by altering their priors and so on. I'll show you an application of that in non-photorealistic rendering in a moment. So a lot of our work centres around non-photorealistic rendering, in particular image-based non-photorealistic rendering, which is an important challenge because you need to use the computer vision to analyse content of images and then extract that information, represent it somehow, and then represent that information using computer graphics techniques. So it's an important challenge within this convergence area, and it's one of the reasons we're particularly interested in it at Bath. An observation that underlies a lot of our work at Bath is a comment summed up by art historian E.H. Gombrich in the 60s, which is work of art are not mirrors. So rather than depicting a scene photorealistically, so with all the details, for example, in the scene, an artist abstracts the scene and paints essentially what's important to him or her. And this sort of abstraction can be seen in all sorts of artwork. Here we have a lot of emphasis here and detail painted on the face, and detail in the background abstracted away. And this sort of differential level of emphasis is something that we've tried to create automatically in our algorithms, and that was a novel contribution of our work. I'll show you how it fits in the context of other image-based non-photorealistic rendering work, if I may. Back in the 90s, in the early 90s, Haberli published a paper in SIGGRAPH, essentially an interactive system whereby paintings could be transformed, so photographs could be transformed into paintings on a point-and-click basis. As many of you No, you click on the photograph, a stroke is dolloped down of the colour that's been point sampled from that location, and paintings can be quite quickly generated. The user chooses the size of the brush to basically affect this differential emphasis we've been talking about. Some later work tried to automate this, essentially using high-pass filters such as Sabel edge detectors, which identify high-frequency detail such as fine texture and edges, and try to scale the strokes in inverse proportion to this. This can create automatic renderings, but they look very machine-generated because they emphasize all the detail, whereas we should only really be emphasizing, we argue, the salient detail in an image. There's been recent work in 2002 in SIGGRAPH by Doug DiCarlo, which used an eye tracker to try and affect this differential level of emphasis, but this is, again, an interactive system, and you could imagine that interaction perhaps not scaling so well to video or animations. So something we've tried to do is to affect this differential emphasis in an automatic way using trainable perceptual salience measures. So, so salience-based rendering, our argument is that rather than using local operators such as Sabel edge detectors, we should be looking, which essentially just within a certain window can identify the content, the high-frequency content within that window. Rather, we should be taking a more global view. When someone talks about what's important in an image, they're talking about importance relative to the remainder of the image, so it becomes necessary to look at it in a more global fashion. At least that's our argument. We've got an example of a terrible photo of myself here, edge detected. The edges, edge map makes it very hard to differentiate between details on the face and details on the non-salient backgrounds because they're of similar scale and so on. Whereas with our global measure, which is premised upon rarity, which I'll go into in a moment, we get something that's at least qualitatively closer to a human sketch, if you like. And we use this to drive, in fact, this was an early version of our measure. We use that to drive the Cubist work. We have a slightly more advanced measure for the painting. Our rarity-based measure is based on building eigenmodels of measures taken across the image. So we take a sample of a window of a particular pixel, build a series of measures based on a convolution with Gaussian derivatives, throw that vector of measures into a high-dimensional space and build an eigenmodel of all of these measures. We can then identify which of these measures or pixels are the outliers in the model, and they become the rare pixels. And this technique is, if you like, borrowed from robotics literature, which uses salient markers, rare markers to navigate, and in particular a paper in the British Machine Vision Conference by Walker and others. This rarity measure works acceptably well in some cases, but rarity really isn't enough. If you consider the definition of salience, it's as essentially what's important, then you realise it's quite task-specific. If I'm walking down, say, the high street and I'm looking for my friend, only one face in the crowd would be salient to me. But if I was, say, counting faces, then it would be salient, all the faces would be salient. So there's a certain amount of subjectivity there in a definition that you can't encapsulate using a prescriptive measure such as rarity. So we've tried to augment this rarity with two other measures in our salience classifier. First of all, visibility, which is something we had to introduce because things like JPEG artifacts tended to be quite rare in the image and tended to be highlighted. So we put in the assumption that if something can't be seen, it can't be said to be salient, which seemed reasonable. Then we have this introduction of subjectivity into the system through this user-trainable measure. Essentially, the user can click on a training set of images, identifying classes of salient feature. Now here we've used ridges, edges, and corners, but really they're just examples of things the user might choose. And we train these equivalence classes of measures, and they're trained incrementally using our Gaussian addition technique, clustered in a high-dimensional space and used as a component in our salience measure. I'm sorry I can't go into so much detail, but you can ask questions at the end so that I cover all the material. The upshot is, anyway, that we're able to produce a salience map that is a 2D field where the value is proportional to the perceived salience at that point, but at the same time also classify the salient artifacts we've encountered. So in this example, we have red for edges, green for ridges, and blue for corners. So, and this is taken as input to our non-photorealistic rendering algorithm. So we have a salience map for each pixel and essentially what it is. And that allows us to alter, say, for example, the style of stroke according to the type of artifact we've encountered. This is just a brief summary of our performance, if you like, of our salience measure against ground truth sketches by humans. This is a precision recall graph. Here we have humans versus humans in terms of sketches and how well they agree. Our measure here is in yellow. This variable along here is essentially just the threshold at which we turn the salience map into a binary image. And there are various other measures here, for example, some work from Berkeley here on the dotted blue line, and also the canny edge detector here doing quite poorly, which is not surprising given our definition that high-frequency detail isn't necessarily correlating with salient detail. So in order to create our paintings then, we want to affect this differential level of emphasis. So we want to control the level of detail in proportion to the salience at a particular point in the image, so that we really concentrate and paint the details of the things that are important to us as a sort of virtual artist, if you like. In order to do this, we just make one pass over the image and place strokes and say scale them according to the salience map, but the noise in the image makes this very impractical. And so we've adopted a kind of relaxation-based approach whereby strokes are placed on a canvas and relaxed using a genetic search technique to produce paintings which are basically near our optimum, and we define our optimum as a painting in which the level of detail in the painting is correspondent to the level of the magnitude of the salience map. Yeah.
What was the relationship between the finding the rare things and having the user label things? That wasn't quite clear.
Right. I'm sorry I couldn't put enough detail in.
So those are two alternative approaches.
Well, we started off saying we got this rarity based, basically salience is proportional to rarity. That turned out not to be good enough, so we built on top of that a constraint that basically dampened down areas that were invisible, if you like. And also we introduced this third component to the classifier, which was this user-trainable measure. And they're essentially put in as weights into this weighted function to get the full salience map out at the end. So something has to be rare, has to be visible, and it has to be salient according to the trainable measure.
So in the user training data, you showed that they mark like ridges or corners or edges, but
right.
Actually what you have them do is say this is salient or not salient.
Yeah, they mark salient artifacts. So the system is not only learning that all the things that are marked are salient, but also it's learning the various classifications between them at the same time. And as I say, that lets us sort of, for example, in this image, it's let us paint thick edges with thick black strokes and ridges with sort of thin wispy strokes, which is an example. And that's the salience map over there.
What actually happens is the system uses the classification based on probabilities, so that over the whole image there's a probability map. And if we have the probability of it being rare, probability of it belonging to a particular class, then we can combine those probabilities perhaps in any way we choose.
I'll give you, there's a reference in a minute if you want to.
No, I just want to know how it works. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, in terms of how we search for these paintings, right? So it's an adaptation of Hertzmann's SIGGRAPH 98 paper, which is the curved paint strokes algorithm. The idea was that, for those of you, I don't know how many of you know of Hertzmann's algorithm. See yourself. You start off with a seed point, and based on the direction of the Sabel field, you hop in a particular direction to get to another control point for the spline, and you keep hopping until some color threshold is exceeded effectively, and that produces your control points for a beta spline stroke. What we do here is, in our technique, is to say rather than just hop according to the Sabel field, we accept that there's going to be a certain amount of camera noise and so on in the image, and the hop should rather be regarded as stochastic in the sense that it can be within a certain range. If you model the noise, can get the standard deviation of the noise, and you can hop and take a random hop in that direction. And by producing essentially a population of paintings where all these strokes have been laid down inaccurately using this stochastic hopping technique, and then relaxing those strokes via this genetic algorithm technique, which essentially takes individuals, which are each paintings in this population, and actually breeding the paintings with one another by exchanging strokes. By natural selection, we get this kind of convergence towards more optimal paintings. I'll show you some results. This sketchy painting here is an example of a pre-relaxation painting to show you the sort of degree of freedom that we're dealing with. So this is I hope this comes out. Sometimes they don't work so well on the projector, but this is an example of the first generation of a painting of a dragon. And as the relaxation process goes on, this is the best individual in the 30th generation, and this in the 70th generation. So you can see the strokes are becoming placed more precisely to accentuate the salient areas and abstract away unwanted detail here in the backgrounds, which were ripples on the water, which were quite high frequency. Some more results here showing some sort of stroke alignment on some sunflowers. More interesting, this example, again, I hope this comes out over the projector. We have an example of a salience map of the original image for this. A salience map for the original image of this, and a Sabel field here. And what we're showing is that we can differentiate here between the salient detail on the face and the non-salient high-frequency detail on the rock, whereas with a Sabel measure, which is what the existing techniques like, for example, Hertzmann's use, can't really differentiate between the two. And the result is, if you try and threshold that salience map to dampen down on non-salient detail, let's say, for example, you want to accentuate the face to this level of detail, then you end up accentuating the rock to the same level. And if you want to abstract away detail like we have here in the rock, then you end up blurring the face. So with our technique, you get this differential level of emphasis across the entire image, which is the contribution, if you like. Another example here, just showing we've manually dampened down the salience map here to show the sort of difference that non-salient and salient areas can make. This is a comparison with the Levinovich technique of 1997 in SIGGRAPH, where we have an original image, the technique here, which has clearly emphasized the sort of shrubbery in the background, which is non-salient to an equivalent degree as a sign. And here we've abstracted away detail in the background and sort of kept the emphasis on the sign. And there's some citations there at the bottom for further reading if you're interested. Something I mentioned at the beginning of the talk was our Cubist-style rendering technique. And the interesting question we thought approaching Cubist-style rendering would be, could we produce non-photorealistic renderings using high-level features like eyes, noses, mouths, and so on, rather than paint strokes? Would there be any value in that? And could we produce control, give the user control of at the compositional level, rather than, say, for example, altering styles by varying maximum stroke length and so on, such as, for example, Hertzmann did in the 98 paper. That's an example, some example renderings here of a still life and a portrait. This is our ex-education secretary, now defense secretary, which made it to the front page of the Times. Very briefly, our technique works by essentially a user-assisted process in which a salience map is produced and the user can cluster salient pixels to extract the salient features. We can't obviously solve the general segmentation problem here. We have some automation, fully automated examples, for example, in well-studied cases such as the face, but there's still some user intervention required for things like the guitar and so on. These are distorted a little bit to make them look more Cubist-like, but really the contribution is that the user can then control the composition with this sort of balance parameter, which will, when these things are extracted, they're put into equivalence classes like eyes, noses, mouths, and so on, and we can produce a composition with the same sort of balance or way off, completely unbalanced, and the user has control over that. So I also mentioned earlier some work in transforming videos into cartoons. We've produced a system which we call the video paint box, which addresses two aspects of this process. First of all, we try and stylize the video without introducing a distracting flicker, which is a big problem in video NPR. But we also address the problem of emphasizing motion in the sequence itself, for example, using traditional cues like streak lines and squash and stretch and these sort of things. Let's give you an example of the sort of output we can produce. Here's an example of myself a couple of years ago bouncing a ball against the wall. And here's an example of a sort of watercolor style rendering, but with streak lines. You can see that the ball impacts as it hits against the wall. And we have streak lines and so on. So a number of animation cues being used there.
And there's stretch and squash on the ball as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if you can. I'll play it one more time so you can see as it flies through the air. I don't think I've got time to talk about the architecture of the system, but basically we've integrated the coherent shading and the motion emphasis into one system.
What causes the halos around the areas of the constant color regions?
That's actually a stylized effect. We don't necessarily have to have that. In fact, the way this works, as I say later, is in a similar way to Michael's work from based at this institution, in that we use a spatiotemporal approach to segmenting the video. And in this case, we basically erode the spatiotemporal volumes and then blur the edges and just basically multiply some sort of noise texture over it to give a kind of watercolor effect. It's not anywhere near as sophisticated as, say, the Curtis 97 work for watercolor modeling. Okay, so these are the sort of motion cues we can introduce. We have we've given them these classifications, but they're based on the Lasseter paper of '87, where he talks about this sort of stuff. Augmentation cues, which are basically augmenting the video with marks, like for example streak lines, ghosting lines, to emphasise speed and also changes in speed in the case of ghosting lines. We have deformation cues, where objects deform to emphasise their motion, squash and stretch. Being a case in point earlier, but also we have situations where objects will, say, deform, like the heavy head of the axe will cause the shaft to swing back before he takes a blow here against the tree. So we have various types of deformation we can introduce. And also we have dynamic cues, which alter the timing of the animation as well, and alter the pose of objects and basically their spatiotemporal position in the video. There are various challenges that we need to address to introduce motion emphasis, the first of which is to compensate for any camera motion, because in order to emphasize the motion, we have to be able to measure it with accuracy. The way we do this is by essentially computing interframe homographies between the camera frames to try and estimate the camera ego motion, and subtract that from the video. We don't actually create panoramas, but we use the motion parameters. That's just an example there showing how we track the ball in a panning shot. Occlusion handling is also an issue. Some objects will, let's see if I can find the mouse pointer. Objects will tend to become occluded in video. For example, the ball here becomes occluded as it passes behind the hoop, but we're able to handle that transparently. So that's another issue. I haven't got a lot of time to go into the issue of streak lines and how they're created, except to say that it's not as simple as producing point trajectories. A streak line is more like a sketch or impression of an object's motion rather than its absolute trajectory through the video. And that can be illustrated here with this toy example of the sheep, where we have point trajectories that really look very, very little like streak lines as an animator would draw them. Rather, we have to produce some sort of correspondence between the trailing edges based on a series of heuristics which we've encoded through talking to animators. That's non-trivial in a sense anyway, because the trailing edge and its geometry and topology and so on varies as a function of motion. I've shown an example of deformation cues, but this slide is simply saying that some types of motion cue require analysis of the video. So, for example, here we have to detect collisions in the scene in order to interpolate between an in-flight model of a ball and an impact model of a ball here from video, which is a contribution. Let me see if I can show you a demonstration. A couple of recruited PhD students throwing a ball to one another. Okay, and the effect in flight. So that's demonstrating the compensation for camera motion there as well. We also have recently been working on dynamic cues, which, as I say before, talking about changing the timing of the video. So here we have the kind of snap effect that animators use to emphasize motion. This is combined with our deformation effect, so the anticipation is applied first, and then the deformation on top of it. We're also able to affect the pose of objects in other ways, for example, using motion cartooning. This is an example of some source video which has then been emphasized to produce a silly Monty Python type walk, essentially, but that's achieved by we automatically recover the articulation of a structure by determining the pivot points between trapped polygons, and then we're able to create a trajectory through a pose space which we then, in this case, is cyclic, and we can work out where the mean is and scale away from it and, along its principal components of variation to produce this kind of exaggerated effect. This is an early result at trying to produce some sort of Duchamp-like futurist renderings to complement our Cubist stuff. The idea here is by filtering this trajectory in the pose space, we're able to determine where the salient points, the temporally salient points are, and try to emphasize those. It does fit into the same framework, but there isn't really enough time to. Okay, so that was the motion emphasis. I'll talk very briefly now about this stroke surface framework, which is the thing that drives the coherent rendering side of our framework, which we saw earlier with the watercolor effect. As I said before, this is similar in some respects to work done here, in that we process the video as a spatiotemporal volume rather than translating sort of strokes from frame to frame to frame, which cause a lot of flicker and due to accumulated error in the image sequence. Some differences, for example, are the fact that the way we fit the surfaces, we fit surfaces between objects, video objects in the sequence, and that allows us to smooth the interfacing surfaces, which and the objects that are on either side of the surface are then automatically smooth without having to worry about introducing holes, for example, into the sequence. And the way we segment the volume in itself is using a sort of 2D plus time approach, whereby frames are segmented independently rather as a 3D volume, and then associated with one another using a set of heuristics, which then produce a graph system that we filter using morphological filters. As I say, by introducing these surfaces in the spatiotemporal volume and smoothing them, we can produce coherent segmentations, but that in itself isn't always enough. I've got a toy example here of a bear being waved in front of a camera. When this is segmented into a spatiotemporal volume, we get a coherent segmentation, but you can see here where the arm dips over the skirting board. This is just trivially shaded to the mean color of the region. You can see that the mean color changes because of shadow under the bear's arm, causing a nasty flicker in the image sequence. So not only do we have to smooth the boundaries, but also the properties of video objects through the sequence as well. So here we smooth color in a spatiotemporal manner, and you can see we get rid of these sort of artifacts. We can attach more attributes than just color to video objects. We can also attach things like interframe homographies as another attribute in the database. So here we have homographies smoothed over time for a particular region, basically on that planar motion assumption, of course, because it's a homography. These little green dots are showing that we can rotoscope drawings on top of the reference frame we've attached, and in doing so, we facilitate things like coherent painting. For example, this false color painting here of the bear's head, showing how the strokes move without a flicker between sequence. So I'll just conclude this talk now, because I think I may have gone on a little bit too long, just by showing you a show reel of our results for the video paint box, which takes about 3 or 4 minutes. Right. I think I'm going to run into the same difficulty as you had, Peter. Oh, no.
Defamation cues with defamation cues such as squash and stretch in the direction of motion. To detect impacts, we automatically detect and analyze collisions. The system deforms objects in a cartoon-like manner. General deformations are also possible. We key on velocity to suggest drag, and on acceleration for inertia. objects are often occluded. Our system handles these transparently. Animators often alter timing to emphasize motion. We automatically extract articulated dolls to make this easier and alter the pose over time, allowing common effects such as anticipation, which we can incorporate with our other motion cues in the same framework. We can affect pose more generally. To get effects such as Monty Python waltz. For coherent rendering, we treat the video as a volume with time as the third dimension. We partition the video into subvolumes separated by surfaces which have been smoothed. Now we can control coherence, and so reintroduce different kinds of incoherence.
The sort of sketchy effect was produced by shattering the surfaces and jittering them by a sort of random affine transformation.
The system attaches rigid frames, giving a moving canvas to draw on. The motion of paint strokes is now naturally coherent. We can map painted objects onto any background. Advanced rotoscoping is also possible.
There's a problem with the soundtrack there, I think.
Motion cues and coherent painting are integrated in our system. This example shows how cartoons can be generated using our video paint box.
Okay, so that is that. So there's a lot of work ongoing on these projects, especially in reducing the amount of interaction that's involved, because again, it's not solving the general segmentation problem here, but anyway. So closing remarks really. We're still very interested in this sort of convergence area at Bath. We see it as the vision components not only sort of giving something to the graphics in terms of more advanced techniques for analysing input imagery and extracting information which can then be used for rendering, but also that the graphics motivates new computer vision research as a result, and we think this is an exciting area to be working in. A lot of the philosophy behind our work is rather than just filtering images, either in a temporal per frame nature or using, for example, local windows, is to take, if you like, a higher level approach to processing, in the sense that we sort of start building very, very basic models like, for example, region segmentation and so on. And we think that this is really going to be driven a lot more by sort of computer vision methods in the future. We think there's a big role for computer vision to play in non-photorealistic rendering. And finally, we think there's a lot of potential for some of these techniques for sort of industrial use, and we've received a couple of prizes at recent conferences for industrial contributions and so on, potential for industry. Okay, so I'm sorry if that was a bit of a whirlwind tour, but I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah.
When I saw the nice effects that you're doing, it made me think of Irfan Essa's visual effects course that he teaches at Georgia Tech.
Right.
Are you familiar with that? Have you been in contact with him?
I haven't been in contact with him, but I'm familiar with some of his work.
Right. So you may know some of his work as in reading it, but he's been teaching this very popular course at Georgia Tech, where the students basically, the goal of the course is to create some visual effects, either to do some rotoscoping, add some augmentation, do NPR video or something like that.
Okay.
So I think his stuff is on the web. I'm just going to send him a pointer to your work because I think it's very relevant. He may want to suggest that for some of the projects, but you should contact him independently, have a look at what he's doing.
Yeah, I will do. Thanks very much.
Both because he may want to use some of your material, and you guys might want to consider whether that's something you might want to teach at Bath, because it's very popular with students.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay. All right. So, thanks very much for coming along.
Yeah.